Welcome to Jay's Analysis. I wanted to make a brief, I'll try to keep it as brief as possible, but I wanted to make a explanation and a statement type talk, I guess. And also to cover the history of why things went down the way they did and the course that I took. And if anybody has followed Jay's Analysis, you know that I did podcasts a few years ago with Dean Arnold on his Global Storyline podcast, which are still on YouTube. They're pretty easy to find. I think we did 2 or 3. I can't remember exactly, but I didn't hide my history there, so I've covered it when people ask. First of all, I'd say that the fact that people, if someone asks me on Twitter or something like that, the fact that I don't rehearse my entire life story is not a means of covering up something secretly. So I'm going to give you all the juicy details, and you can have all the gossip, and you can hear it directly from me. But I think you're going to be a little let down because there's really not that much dirt or gossip. And, I'll tell you all the bad stuff and all the good stuff. So everybody, I think, knows I was raised as an evangelical. And about age 18, 19, I also, as I got more serious about reading Scripture, I got into Calvinism, biblical theology. I think everybody's familiar with this rough history. About age 22, I started looking at the history of the church. And this really kind of led me down the road of looking at the church fathers. And at the time, I wasn't really familiar with anything Eastern. I mainly just knew about Augustine or Augustine from Calvinism, because in the world of Calvinism, there's a high regard for St. Augustine. And so I dove into his works very, very heavily throughout my 20s. I read City of God when I was 21. By age 22, I bought the Philip Schaff Church Fathers set, which is, I think, 38 volumes. And so I started diving into that, but I still didn't really have any reference point for Eastern Church Fathers. And I think for most people in the West, in America, if you are doubting Protestantism, you really just tend to automatically de facto assume Roman Catholicism. And so I was very impressed by what I read in City of God and what I read in the Confessions. I read some of the more well-known works of Augustine at that time. So I didn't really know anything about the Filioque. I didn't know anything about those kinds of questions and issues. I just kind of looked at, being so hardcore Calvinist and Protestant, I was very enmeshed in Reconstructionism, in Gary North, in Greg Bahnsen, Rushdoony, the Westminster Confession, and the classic kind of Calvinist doctrines of the Murray and Hodge and Berkhoff and all those characters. So it was a pretty shocking issue, to kind of come to the admission that, again, around, I think, right age 22 or 3, that there were a lot of problems, and I was having difficulty justifying the formation of the canon specifically. The problematic statements in all these church fathers that seem to be Catholic. And if you're a hardcore Calvinist, you really have a hard time with ideas like the church calendar, ideas of worship, liturgy, iconography, relics, saints, the Eucharist, the real presence. All these issues become very problematic. And specifically the lack of the doctrine of justification by faith alone, which is a central tenet of the Reformers. So the more that I delved into it, the more questions I had, the more difficult it became. And I think I maybe popped into a few Catholic churches around age 21, 22, but I put it on the back burner, and I kind of held out for a little bit longer because I thought, well, I'll just give Calvinism some more time. I'll enmesh myself more in Protestantism. And I had a Calvinist minister at that time who, a very nice, studious guy, he said, well, maybe try out Anglicanism. So I read, I think, Peter Toon or somebody like that, who had written some defenses of Anglicanism, but I never was really impressed with Anglicanism, and I wasn't impressed with Lutheranism. I had read about 6 or 7 books from Martin Luther when I was 21. I also read some Lutherans who were interested in Roman Catholicism. I think the guy's name is Karl Broughton or somebody like that, but he was a very Roman Catholic leaning Lutheran, and I read his book one time. So I was kind of looking at all the options, and around, I think it was my first year of Bible college, I think I heard about Timothy Ware's book, and he had written a book on the history of the Orthodox Church or something. I thought, well, maybe I'll check that out one day. But again, Orthodoxy just seemed completely foreign. It didn't really seem relevant to this dominance of, the I guess you could say, a dialectic of Rome and the reformers that I was so enmeshed in. So from that point, at about age 22, 23, I decided that I should probably not only delve into the church fathers, but also the formation of the canon. So I bought a whole bunch of books from evangelical and Protestant scholars and scholars from other traditions, some Jesuit works on the history of the canon, some Anglican works. I bought the Westcott Hort Greek New Testament, which has a lot of research and study on the history of the canon. At the same time as I began to look into the history of the liturgies and how the liturgies were also important in the formation of the canon as well. So a lot of different questions were kind of coalescing in my mind at the same time. And eventually I felt that Calvinism just wasn't sustainable from a historic perspective, and then eventually also from a biblical perspective, because again, for me, in my mind, both sola scriptura and salvation by faith alone eventually caved. I found that I could not justify them in a coherent way, biblically, philosophically, and historically. And then, of course, Alistair McGrath wrote his famous book around that time, somewhere maybe before that, about Justitia Dei, the history of the doctrine of justification, that it really didn't exist prior to Luther in the Reformation form, which would then mean that the church basically did not have the gospel for 1,500 years, 1,600 years, whatever. So, I was done with Protestantism, and again, still had no knowledge of the East. So what I want to stress here is that some people have said, well, you've just kind of hopped churches a different year. No, that's not at all what happened. In fact, I attended as a Protestant pretty much that Calvin. I was raised Baptist, so when I went from Baptist, I kind of went pretty straight into Presbyterianism, and was a Calvinist for, 18, 19, 20, 4 years, somewhere in there. And also the year that I studied at Vaughan Seminary was also Presbyterian. So really, there've only been like 3 major religious conversions in my life, changes of mind, you could say. So and really, even amongst Baptists, there are plenty of Baptists who are Calvinists and lean Calvinists. So, I recognize that Calvinists and Baptists are different, but even Doug Wilson has created an entire denomination where Presbyterian leaning, infant baptizing people and Reformed Baptists supposedly can somehow get together and have communion, even though they completely disagree over the fundamentals of the sacraments. But the point being is that, it's not a big leap from Baptist to Calvinist. So at the same time, I was kind of working through issues related to eschatology and what I thought about eschatology, pre-mill, amillennial, and post-millennial. So I think pretty quickly I gave up on premillennialism. It's pretty easy to refute that. You start to see that it's a heresy. I think there was a brief period where I was when I first started reading the Bible at age 18, I was kind of initially a dispensationalist, and I thought that the rapture and the premillennial, all that kind of stuff was true. But I think as a person matures in scriptures, they get better theology. And as you move back in history, you get better theology. So I was kind of moving gradually back from Baptists and Spurgeon and those guys back to, Puritans and Calvin and Luther, and then moving back further into, well, maybe I should check out these medieval guys too. So then this led to the next phase where I was enamored again, both with Augustine, St. Augustine, and Aquinas. And so I got very deeply into the Summa, very deeply into traditional Roman Catholic theology. The other Latin church fathers, Ambrose, Jerome, Hilary, and I had settled, the questions of the canon. It seemed obvious to me that the historic church determined what the books of the canon would be. It seemed obvious to me they had a different canon from the Protestants. It was pretty obvious that Luther just sort of tossed out books that he didn't like the Deuterocanon, as well as other Protestants that followed him, and yet some Protestants didn't follow him in that. So it seemed pretty chaotic. And then what happens, of course, is that when you enter something like Roman Catholicism or any church really, you encounter a new set of problems. I didn't think that the grass would necessarily be greener. I recognized that there's always going to be problems in churches, but for me, the issues, anybody who knows about Roman Catholicism, eventually you encounter the problems of Vatican II and traditionalism. So I have a couple talks on that. I'm not going to go deeply into that. Some actually very popular talks that have had a lot of views over the last couple of years, and you can delve into those to see the evolution of. And again, this is not just me, but actually, quite a few people have this same kind of journey, and it's not a matter of the people being unstable. It could be in some cases, but that kind of a blanket explanation really doesn't deal with the actual arguments and objective facts about the corruption and sort of degeneration of the doctrines of those churches. And so eventually one has to confront Vatican II, has to confront modernism and Roman Catholicism, and one has to decide how they're going to, in their own mind, their own conscience, their own beliefs, reconcile or admit that they can't reconcile the pre-Vatican II teachings, or especially the encyclicals of the last few hundred years, in comparison to Second Vatican Council and everything that the popes after Vatican II have enforced. And so this, most of the time, it leads people into various flavors of Catholic traditionalism, right? They want you kind of begin by, I don't really like this guitar hippie mass, so-called, of the Novus Ordo, and I'd like to find something a little more traditional. So people they try to find a reverent Novus Ordo, which is a new order of the mass that was brought in after Vatican II, or they look for a indult, which is a diocesan Latin mass, or they look for a mass of the Fraternal Society of St. Peter, or they look for a mass of the Society of St. Pius X, or any other smaller various versions of groups that offer the Tridentine Latin Mass that are supposedly in communion with Rome. Now, this is, a kind of a halfway house, a kind of a conduit, you might say, a niche that people go into in the world of traditional Roman Catholicism. And it's a very difficult niche because, again, here you are spending your days and your nights essentially defending the papacy as the means by which Christians are united. The church is united, founded on this rock. And at the same time, the papacy that actually exists over in Rome is completely against you. They're completely against your group. They don't care about your traditions. They're not interested in the maintenance of traditional morality, traditional Catholic culture, or any of the things that you believe in. In fact, they are the revolutionaries, and they've been the revolutionaries arguably even prior to Vatican II and perhaps even further back. That's a different topic. So being confronted with these kinds of difficult issues, a lot of people give up, they despair. I tried to continue forward, trying to make myself consistent with it. And as some people do, that leads them to the route of sedevacantism, that the idea that the successors of the chair of Peter after Vatican II or around have been invalid. And if you're familiar with Roman Catholic sacramentology, it's often a question of valid and invalid. It's very, very legalistic. So sedevacantism, the empty chair of Peter, was not very tenable. It's an untenable position, but it's kind of, again, another version of a halfway house where you kind of just sort of are in this limbo state. There's no perceived solution to this problem. It's, just pray the rosary or something like that. But there doesn't seem to be any apparent means by which, in the Roman Catholic scheme, that is, the church would ever be restored or repaired. So they fall back on, oh, Mary will save us one day. There'll be some Marian intervention or whatever. It'll be miraculous or whatever. But the irony here is that if you look at the different groups of the Sedevacantist over the years, they are as divided and split as the Protestants, rivaled only by Calvinists for their legendary splits over minutiae. So, over time, the thesis just becomes very untenable. I mean, okay, so on paper, you might have all these arguments about Sedevacantism, but really in the day-to-day and in reality, it just becomes impossible and untenable and leads quite a few people to despair and to giving up. So I got to that point of not necessarily despair, but I was just like, this really doesn't seem plausible. Maybe it's time to rethink things and reconsider, Eastern theology or something. So I decided to check out some Orthodox churches. This is around 2007 or 8. And it wasn't an overnight thing. I did appreciate the beauty of the liturgy, the traditional aspects of the liturgy that Rome had for the most part lost. But it was a very different spirit, too, from the Gothic sort of Latin Mass approach, which is very cold and sort of, a God who's kind of far off type view. And I appreciated the warmth and the intimacy of the Orthodox liturgy. So I got a prayer book, and I said, well, you know what, I'm going to start reading the Eastern Church Fathers, because I've spent a tremendous amount of time reading Latin Church Fathers, but now it's time to dig into the East. And I did. I dug in heavily, not just into the Church Fathers, but also into, more modern Orthodox works. So I read extensively the volume in my Church Fathers set of St. Basil. I read extensively St. Gregory of Nazianzus, read all the theological orations. I read St. Gregory of Nyssa pretty extensively. And I was impressed. I was seeing a lot of things that I had never thought about, never noticed. I still was kind of new to the questions of filioque and essence-energy distinction, and why was that such a big deal? I don't really get why that's such a big deal. And it took another 10 years. I mean, I did eventually understand, I would say around 2009 or so, most of the questions of the essence-energy distinction and how it related. I have old articles where you can see where I did write on this and accurately understand and explain it for the most part. But it still seemed kind of a nuanced scholastic thing. It didn't seem like why is this so important? I don't get it. And I kind of dove into some of the writings of St. Maximus, some of the more popular writings, Cosmic Liturgy. At the same time, I missed the scriptures. I as a Protestant, I really dove into the scriptures, and, you're pretty much obsessive about the Bible if you're a Protestant and you're serious about it. And I felt like in Roman Catholicism that there was kind of a vague appreciation for the scriptures, but, it still wasn't the same sort of intimacy that I sensed when I was even a Calvinist. So, I started reading scripture again. I got very reinvigorated by reading scripture. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll give Orthodoxy a chance. So the more I dove into Orthodoxy, the more I was impressed. However, initially at that time, even 10 years ago, things were fairly different. There wasn't a whole lot of Orthodoxy online. Even in 2007, 2008, there were a few blogs. There were some websites and some places that had articles and archives, but there wasn't a big presence. There wasn't a lot of people debating or arguing topics like that, like there are on YouTube now. So it was a different situation. So it was kind of you kind of felt like a loner in a way, because I didn't know anybody who had converted from Roman Catholicism to Orthodoxy. The few people that I met that were converts were evangelical converts, right, who had gone directly to Orthodoxy. So they didn't really have any frame of reference for Calvinism. They didn't have any frame of reference for talking to anybody who knew the ins and outs of Thomism and Roman Catholicism. So I kind of just had to find that on my own reading, but I did bump into some people online who knew quite a bit about those things, and that was very helpful. And they kind of directed me to different books to read and different Orthodox theologians to check out. So, gradually I did that. And at the same time, I was in a relationship. I was going to be married at the time. And it was a very awkward situation because she was about 2.5, 3 hours from me. And the church that we were both attending was near her. And it was very difficult for me to always attend the services, as you can imagine. At that time, also, I was in grad school. Gas was not cheap. If you remember 2008, 9, 10, gas was a nightmare. So I didn't have a lot of money, especially not in grad school. So it was not easy to, throw down $60 to drive 3 hours. Well, however, I did attempt as best I could. I think about once a month, I was driving to Nashville from where I lived to, well, actually, it's not Nashville, it's south of Nashville, to be catechized. And it was a sort of a special catechism set up for somebody who lived far away. I'm not going to say what church or where, but I was eventually kind of let down. I didn't feel like that this church was very serious about converts. I got really angry one time because I drove 3 hours basically, and the catechism was the priest forgot because of a Super Bowl party. So I said to myself, well, this is all I need to know. They care more about the Super Bowl than they do converts here. So this is can't be where it's at. At the same time, I decided not to marry this girl for personal reasons, not because of flaws per se in her, but we both decided it was not the wisest decision, and it wasn't right. So it was the right decision to not get married. And she, however, continued to go there, and I did not. So that was another reason that factored into this. It was very awkward, obviously, to continue to go to the church where your person you're about to marry decides that you decide not to marry. And it was mutual. So then I was kind of in a weird situation because there weren't any other churches. There was another one that was less than Orthodox, I'll put it that way. And if you want the skinny on that, just simply put, I went and visited and I asked what their stance on Freemasonry was. And they said they love Freemasonry and all Freemasons are welcomed. And I walked out the door because that's all I needed to know. So I don't at all feel like it was my fault in either of these cases. I don't think I did anything wrong. It was a very unique situation, I guess, in both cases, because obviously in the second case, they had never had anyone ask about the stance on Freemasonry. I knew all about it. I know all about the history of it, and I knew why it mattered. And I knew at that time the relationship of intelligence agencies to ecumenism, big families to ecumenism, the relationship of ecumenism to the New World Order. And the people that I met were pretty rabid ecumenists, pretty much everywhere. And that was a big turnoff because, I picked up a Greek Orthodox Archdiocese manual at the time, and it says, I still have it, so don't make converts. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not Orthodox. So that was a big turnoff. So if it wasn't going to be Greeks and it wasn't going to be another church, there weren't a whole lot of options for me. And so I could either eventually move, which was kind of what I figured I would do. I figured, well, I'll go to grad school. I'll move away. However, that was not in the cards, and I didn't go to grad school. So I was kind of stuck in a situation of being in a small town, very far away from any kind of Orthodox church that either was interested or wasn't completely Masonic or weird. So I thought, well, okay, I've got all this theology on paper, and I've read all this stuff. I've met a few people online, a few people who were actually complete jerks. So what's the point of this? I eventually kind of got frustrated. I got fed up, and I'm not saying that it was right to get fed up and frustrated, but if you've devoted your whole life to this, and at one time I was even pursuing monastic life in the Roman Catholic Church before I found out how corrupt all that was, and then was no longer interested in that. It's very disheartening to discover the reality of things. And I saw a lot of it firsthand in terms of, how power structures work and, I had been studying the deep state and these kinds of issues for a long time. And if you brought up any of that, to anybody in the churches, it was all just, oh, you're crazy. I remember the church that I was going to join, be chrismated in. We had a discussion one day about, I mentioned false flags, just kind of in passing. And I mentioned some critiques of some other heresies. And I was pretty much shouted down and out, almost asked to leave. So that was a big turnoff for me. And ironically, the stuff that I was talking about then would not even be controversial now. Again, it's stuff related to criticisms of Bartholomew that I was making even then, discussions of CIA influence in Orthodoxy even then. And I was given the distinct impression that I was not welcome there. Again, I had not committed any serious moral flaws or faults. I was not under any bans or had done anything illegal or scandalous or anything like that. It was quite literally due to the serious nature of a lot of the questions I was asking. So that was kind of a downer, obviously, as you can imagine. So I just, forget it. I don't even care about going to church anymore. And that's why I'm not too hard on people who don't get all the P's and Q's right in terms of conversion or chrismation or, the timing of this and that, which a lot of people have been hypercritical about, is because you don't know what the situation I saw was. You don't know the corrupt people that I interacted with. You don't know the questions that I asked and why I was asked to leave. You don't know the, personal decisions that really had nothing to do with corruption, but just deciding not to marry somebody and not to go to that church and not being able to really continue going to that church due to the distance. So, my life took a different turn, and, I just kind of quit going to church. The last time during that period, I went to a Roman Catholic church around 2008, I think. And it was like, I'll give it one last chance. And, when I saw girls in flip-flops up there reading the Novus Ordo, I was like, I'm done. So that was the last time I ever set foot in a Roman Catholic church, was, I think, 2008. I even wrote a kind of a funny blog post about it at the time. Never been back since. Never been back to a Protestant church since 2003, somewhere in there. So the idea that, I'm just hopping around all these churches is completely not true. I tried different churches, and I even went through the catechumenate 10 years ago, I guess, to a certain point. I think I got through most of the catechumenate back then. I think we were coming pretty close to the time of when I would have been chrismated back in 2008. But yeah, and again, if you've experienced different churches, and I've had a lot of people relate their experiences to me, and again, it was a little different back in 2008. It wasn't exactly the same as it is now. Ecumenism and modernism were, as far as I could tell, much more popular. This is before ROCOR had, joined back with the Moscow Patriarchate. It was a little different then. I think if Bartholomew had asked for a pan-Orthodox synod back then, he probably would have got it. But over the last decade, it looks to me like there's been kind of a resurgence of more and more traditional ideas. If that's not the case, then I would have thought that Bartholomew would have got his so-called Synod of Crete. But I can remember arguing with the priest back then, who was so-called traditional. I said, look, I've been in the world of Rome. I know pretty deeply the corruption of the papacy. I knew about the pedophilia scandals all the way back in 2004 because I read a book back then about it. And I said, I know about all the same stuff. It looks like if, this going on in aspects of Orthodoxy in terms of corruption. I'm not saying the pedophilia stuff, although there are some cases of that. I said, but in terms of the corruption, it's very simple. Why else would Bartholomew be so eager to act like he's in union with Rome? Rome is very corrupt. And the priests that I dealt with and interact with were completely ignorant of all of this. Now, they were very educated men, very academically educated, but knew nothing of the corruption in the real world. Come on, get real. You know, and so again, you can see that the nature of the questions that I was asking at that time, and I was very aware of all this stuff, the New World Order, CIA influence, and all this stuff. You know, it wasn't welcomed, and I knew the history of modernism. I knew the history of all this stuff, and it was just like, who is this lunatic guy? And you know, at the time, I was just some theology nerd. Nobody needed to pay attention to that guy. You know, he didn't even have his undergraduate yet. But then over time, oh, guess what? It looks more and more like I was right about so many of those things. And even though I had kind of got burnt out on church, and I even had I wouldn't say I was never agnostic. I always believed God existed. But I did have a period where, well, maybe the Platonists and the Esotericists are true. Maybe the traditionalist, the perennial school is true. I didn't really adopt the school. I didn't like go to some commune or weird initiation rite or anything like that. But I thought maybe esotericism has something to it. So I read a lot of the esoteric writers. I read a lot of the perennialists. And I read a lot of the Platonists and the Neoplatonists. And I looked at, maybe the Kabbalah, which is more or less a version of Platonism or Neoplatonism. Maybe it has some answers. And so I read several Kabbalistic works. And, you know, there was accusations even at the time. People would say orthodoxy and the essence energy distinction is just Kabbalah. And so I thought, well, is that true? Well, maybe if that's true, maybe the Kabbalists are right. Yes. So I had a pretty in-depth familiarity with the Old Testament. Not obviously, I mean, I knew about the Talmud, but I wasn't trained in the Talmud, but I was very familiar with, you know, the Old Testament prophets and all that. So I thought, well, you know, maybe I should look into Kabbalism, look into the history of the Jewish liturgy. Maybe there would be some answers there. And eventually I kind of started noticing that, you know, again, I was drawn back to the continuity between the worship of Orthodoxy and the worship of the synagogue and the temple service. So I basically kind of just did a reset, a reboot. I went back, reread the entire Old Testament several times through, and I kept being struck by the, you know, prophecies of the Gentiles being included. At the same time, I kind of, even though I was burnt out on church and churchianity, I still had an appreciation for St. Maximus and, you know, all these Orthodox theologians. So I went back and I started rereading St. Maximus. And I think it was basically Daniel, preterism, and St. Maximus that really kind of started drawing me back towards the possibility of, well, maybe I could look back into Orthodoxy. Maybe I was wrong. And this is the thing, is that people, I think, tend to assume that in these situations that it's just me, you know, like off the cuff, sort of, you know, shooting at the hip, flying off crazy, not knowing what I think or what I believe, and I'm just kind of like tossed around. No, and actually, you know, more so, it's a question of being unsure of your own flaws, being willing to be corrected, knowing that you've been wrong in the past, but at the same time realizing, yes, I can learn and come to truth. Truth, you know, the word is near us, even in our hearts, Paul says. So it's not far off and impossible to reach truth. So, you know, the crux of the point there being is that there's no perfect answer to certitude and attaining the truth, aside from trying to find a balance between being confident and certain, and at the same time having the humility to be open to being corrected. And I think that people who are critical, who maybe don't know the story or the background, have been willing to basically have one side or the other in terms of criticism. In other words, they're willing to, on the one hand, say, "Oh, you're just tossed around like the wind or something." Well, actually, I haven't made that many changes of mind, right? I mean, Baptist Calvinist, that's pretty similar to Roman Catholic, to Orthodox, but doubting it for a long time, and even doubting Christianity, and then coming back and saying, well, maybe Orthodox is right. It's really the only branch of so-called Christianity that I've had any continuing abiding interest in. And so I would say it was about 2000 and what is this, 18, almost 19? It was about 2014 when I was starting the website, starting to blog and do it more regularly, more consistently. I started getting back into apologetics, getting back into reading about Darwin, evolution, getting back into reading about, defenses of the faith against atheism, the books of Genesis, the reliability of Genesis. So I kind of went back into my roots, the stuff that I was into a long time ago, back when I was 20, 21, at the same time as branching out into other Orthodox works that I'd never really explored, like Father Stan Eloy or Father Florovsky at length, or other works by Vladimir Losky, or you name it, right? We're actually getting into reading St. Gregory of Palamas himself, which I had not done 10 years ago. I read the debate with Barlaam 10 years ago, and I thought it was great. But I had not read the triads and so forth. So I went back and I read more Romanides books, and I got more into criticizing Romanides. And then I went and reread, Defense of the Faith by St. John Damascus, which I'd read 10 years ago, and got into more St. Maximus. And, I was just kind of being drawn more and more and more back into the sphere of that version of Christianity. I had started attending some liturgies back in 2014, off and on. Again, I still was living 2 or 3 hours away. And so, in both cases of the church where I was almost chrismated 10 years ago and where I was recently chrismated, the decision of the bishop and the decision of the priest in both cases was to accept my baptism as valid and to receive me via chrismation. Of course, if you read St. Basil's letter on the reception of converts, there's obviously some leeway over the centuries of the church about different ways to receive people. So I don't make a huge deal of being legalistic about the means and methods and modes of reception into the church. It's obviously a question of economia. Again, I do understand Father Peter Hears' book and his arguments. But if you go back and listen to the discussion that we had, I'm not trying to knock him. I think he's a great guy. I completely agree with his critiques of ecumenism. But one of the problems that I think is a valid question is that if we take this very strict, sort of strenuous, legalistic view, I'm not saying he's intentionally doing that. I'm just saying if we do, which some groups do that, and then they'll argue, oh, everybody else has no grace, is completely lost grace or whatever. First of all, we don't see this historically in the church. There have been various modes and means, and it would be absurd to damn all of those people in all those centuries because they didn't have the exact perfect way of being baptized, and then they were later received by chrismation, right? If we look at Canon 8 of Nicaea, it discusses the reception of schismatic bishops, the Novatianists by profession of faith. St. Basil's letter describes the acceptance of people in different situations. So it's not that big of a deal in my view. And also the question too is that if you take a very rigorous legalistic approach, how do you know that your priest doesn't secretly hold heresies? Right? You can never know that. So you can never be sure that you were baptized if you rest everything on the priest having perfect orthodoxy, because a person can have an outward show of morality, and maybe they could secretly be a Satanist, they could secretly be a Nestorian, they could secretly be whatever, it doesn't matter, a Gnostic, secretly be a Luciferian, secretly be a CIA agent who's not really a priest, right? You don't know. you can never be fully 100% certain in that kind of a thing. So it leads to kind of these extreme absurdities, and that's actually the argument that was used against the Cyprianites and against the Donatists and others. That was unanswerable because there's no way to answer that. And that's why the church, again, Orthodox doesn't have the view that Donatists have, and they don't have the view that Roman Catholics have. But there's obviously some room for leeway here. Anyway. And that's not the root of ecumenism, by the way. The root of ecumenism is the Rockefellers and trying to destroy the church. So then kind of getting down to the crux of this, I don't want this to go on too long because there's really not a whole lot more to this. I was I had been fairly lax in my morals during that period of 2010 to 14. I partied a lot. Nothing too extreme, but I didn't really care about, whether I was sleeping with a girlfriend or not, or what I was up to in terms of, partying and going out and getting drunk and all that kind of stuff. And, at the same time, I wasn't confessing for sure that I would be Orthodox, but around 2014, I decided, I think Orthodox is pretty much right. So often, as I said, off and on I would go. And then, over time, over the months, I would be more and more and more certain about it. So I would say for the last 3 or 4 years, at least 3 years, I definitely believed Orthodoxy, and I affirmed it, and I defended it, and, was consistently living it as best I could, given the situation I was in. And then, thank God, I finally had a local church for the last year. So everything worked out providentially, perfectly. In fact, amazingly so. Obviously you don't doubt the fingerprint of God and these kinds of things, just especially when it works out so amazingly that you have a local church like that to join. So people who had known me for a lot of this journey knew where I was at and what all I'd done, and the person that was my godfather knew where I'd come from and what I'd been up to, and so they all vouched for me. There was no great scandal that, like the people who are don't like the work of Abel-Tasos are looking for. There's not really much dirt. I just gave you all the dirt there, so you can do with that what you want. But so I was chrismated last week. It would have been earlier had I had a local church, but it wasn't really until the last year that I had a local church to attend. And of course, my fiance also was chrismated last year, so again, she can testify to all this. She knows it's not a bunch of fraud. It's not. There's no real dirt here. I'm sorry for all the haters. There's not a lot that you can latch onto. In fact, I thought it was kind of funny that before I was chrismated, there was criticisms like, he's not even chrismated. Why is he defending Orthodoxy? How is he making converts to Orthodoxy? He's not even chrismated. Well, if you read Acts 19 and Acts 20, you will see examples of Apollos, the apologist, who was making converts and who was called a disciple, who was considered a brother, though he was not yet chrismated, and he was not yet brought into the church in the normative Orthodox episcopate. So that should be the attitude, right? I mean, that should be the attitude of how we treat people. You see it in Acts 20 with the disciples of John the Baptist as well. They're not treated like outsiders and alien and heretics if they are Trinitarian baptized, and if they are then professing the faith. I mean, this is why catechumens can become martyrs, right? They would not be martyrs if they weren't joined to the church. This is how the infants, right, who were killed by Herod are martyrs. Well, they weren't baptized, were they? And there have been plenty of examples of this. And again, I am not of the legalistic sort, especially having been down the journey that I have. I have a much greater understanding for various worldviews and people's various positions. So I know how to refute those positions. So I think it's God's providence, hopefully, that led me to this point. And yes, it was a long road, but actually there are quite a few Orthodox people who have had a long route to Orthodoxy. So I'm not alone in that. And especially given the weird situations that we're in North America, and given the corruption of churches in North America, I don't think it's feasible to be too strenuous, rigorous, and legalistic because of how difficult it is to find authentic Christianity in America. So in that regard, if you don't like the work of Abel-Tasos, then don't listen to it. I'm not hurt. My feelings aren't hurt. I don't mind if you don't listen to it. However, to say that I don't believe Orthodoxy is pretty absurd. And to say that, I'm not actually attending a church, I wasn't chrismated, that I don't believe these things. Anyone who knows me can easily refute these things. And it was a long road, and that's fine. And there was a bumpy road, and there was, situations where I got fed up with Christianity. And that's how I can understand the positions of the atheists out there. I understand that American Christianity, for the most part, is an atheism factory, right? It's a clown world joke. So I don't have any qualms with discussions with atheists if they're at least open-minded. But the difficulties then, of the Orthodox world are people are going to have to come to grips with powerful structures and entities and foundations and intelligence agencies and families that do influence the church. And there's abundant evidence for that. It just came out today, or yesterday actually, in the article that I posted. You'll see it here. Let me pull that up. Right. I mean, this is everything that I talked about, right? Nobody has apologized to me for calling me crazy for talking about this. Not this year, but for 10 years I've talked about this. And here you see the schismatic fake patriarch is thanking the former head of the CIA for helping to push the schism there. And the same people behind that schism are going to try to push a schism in America. So the fact that I was right about all those things, I think, should testify to the fact that, maybe that's why people didn't really want me in their churches. I mean, I was talking about stuff that was pretty out there, I guess, to people in 2008. Too conspiratorial. Oh, you're a crazy conspiracy theorist. Well, no, I was actually right about all this. So, not saying I'm perfect. I went and, got fed up and partied for a few years and was kind of wild for a few years. And then, thankfully God's grace kind of brought me back. I thought, well, I'll give Orthodoxy another look. And so far, it's all been a blessing. It's all been fruitful. It's all been very positive in my life. And I attribute that, to God's grace. It's not to my own skills and powers and abilities, all of which are gifts of grace anyway. So that's the story. That's the hot gossip there. That's the hot take. And you can do with that what you want. But as you can see, I was chrismated. It is a canonical church. It wasn't made up. And that's my story from age 19 to 30. What am I? 39. I don't even know how old I am. 38, 39, whatever it is. So there you go. So that's where I am. And yes, so that's my status. And yeah, I would have probably been chrismated in 2014 had there been a church anywhere near me. Yeah. And even ironically, in a weird way, I'm kind of glad that I wasn't chrismated back in 2008, because there were a lot of theological things that I didn't understand. I read a lot. I had read more than most people I knew or even met online in terms of the church fathers, church history, formation of the canon, all that, Thomism. I knew more than anybody that I argued with, except for a few people. But even those people weren't really, enmeshed in the ins and outs of Rome. They knew the critiques of Rome. But point being is that there was still several things that I needed to see. I needed to see the real meat of the connection between the doctrines of Christ's incarnation, of the triad, essence energy distinction, the eternal processions, creation as an operation of free will, the divine energies in the incarnation. I needed to read more of Maximus's debate with Pyrrhus, get more into the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And once all that was kind of coalesced and settled, it all made much more sense. And that's why Orthodoxy, really gelled with me, especially as I was also reinvestigating the scriptures, Old and New Testaments. So that's the story, and I thank you all for coming on the journey with me, and it's been very exciting, and hopefully it'll continue to be so, and God bless you guys.